Thank you very much to Natalie von Siemens and Micha Fritz. And ladies and gentlemen, in case you're wondering what was in those little bags, those are traditional German Christmas cookies, Lebkuchen. And you will find that in the course of our conference, holiday treats, especially of the edible kind and drinkable kind, form a common theme. So there's something to look forward to also for those who didn't get a present just now. We'd like to move straight on now to our opening panel, and to set the stage for our discussions over the course of the next 2 days, we have asked representatives of our event partners to share their thoughts on the central topic of our dialogue, namely how STEM education can empower children to contribute to creative, sustainable solutions, and also to give us a few insights as to how that's being applied in practice. So I'm going to ask the members of our opening panel to come to the stage, and I will introduce them up here, and hopefully they all know who they are. If not, I'll give you
united by a why, then the how is like no important. And another thing, I have just three points, and the other thing is, the other thing is that education is for life. And sometimes in Latin America and maybe in Africa, children don't understand why they go to schools. They just go. And they receive a traditional education that is only memorizing and procedures, okay? So the why in education, the sense of education, you know, solving problems makes sense to education. So then you go to do, okay? So learning have a sense to you because you solve problems of your life, of your context. And Latin America and Africa has very difficult context. And another thing is that education should be centered in the human being. In the human being in the 21st century, taking into consideration that we live in different, really different contexts. And another time, Latin America and Africa need all this cooperation that you were talking about, of all these actors that are really, really important for our countries and for the world. Because at the end, we have these local issues, you know, we have to solve local problems that impact in the global context. So STEM education is that way, is the way in which children and the whole community will work together for transform our world. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And that emphasis on the ecosystem, of course, exactly fits in with Alexander von Humboldt's view of connectedness. So let me dive a little bit deeper with some of you now on concrete examples and challenges of what we're talking about. And I'd like to start again with Nio Kabi, if I could. If you would tell us a little bit about how you are approaching STEM education in your work in Kenya, and also in particular what challenges you face.
So we have been working in Nairobi, and it was very intentional for us, and a lot of people will ask the question, why are you going to the capital city? Well, one, because of logistics, but also what we came to realize is that there's a lot of ignorance in terms of infrastructure development in Nairobi, because everybody says, well, we have to go to the rural areas. So you find in Nairobi we have schools that were built in the 1940s. They're falling apart. Toilets have been condemned. Some of these schools have not had water for 5 years. So our interest was, we want to go into these areas where, to us, we consider marginalized in the urban area and have an intervention. And that's how we started experimenting. And our criteria is very simple. We go through the list of performance for KCP, which is primary school results, and we look at the schools that are poor performing, the schools that have high ratio of students because it means the teacher is totally overwhelmed. And also we look at the locality of the school. And from that now we have trained 91 schools. And the most interesting thing is, of course, we went in thinking we have a program. And our program was very specific on teacher training, but then we had to unlearn a lot of the things we knew as experts. And we had to start learning from the teachers and from the children and from the education sector. And the one thing we realized with, for example, teachers is even after we have the training, and that's part of teacher professional development, and we host it with the Teacher Service Commission, how do you continuously add value to the teacher? Training them and sending them out into the world is not enough, because every day they get new needs, and as a STEM program, we have to be able to somehow address them. And what we did is simply started a WhatsApp group. And they run the WhatsApp group with whatever problems they have, and we built a community of support. If it's the children, of course we'll go in and follow up with the program because of monitoring and evaluation. But by meeting children such as Morithi, who are poor performers, but extremely innovative kids, we've also had to unlearn a lot of the things. And what we do now is we provide small grants of $50. Just $50. And with these kids, we show them, you know what, we're listening and we're watching and supporting what you're doing. And out of that, they actually consume the $50 in a week. There are new innovations every week. And then out of that need, now we are actually launching a drive to collect dead electronics in the city and redonate them to the schools, because we realize with our experimental kit, we can only do so much. And these kids, we're having to keep up with them. It's not the other way around. So now we are actually going around and collecting dead electronics and redonating them to schools, so that if a child is curious about, I don't know, a radio, I might not be able to provide a radio, but at least they can go and take it apart and kind of explore that. And the other thing is teacher reforms. And under teacher reforms, we're working very closely with the Teacher Service Commission to make sure that teachers are part of the wider discussion when it comes to policy, but also teachers are doing research and actually contributing publications to what happens in the country.
Thank you very much. But Hirsche, I'd like to ask you about UNESCO's Global Action Program on Education for Sustainable Development. It was launched in 2015, and its 5-year span is just about over. So if you would just say a word, please, about where progress stands, where you encountered challenges, and would you say that you've come far enough on your goal of mainstreaming education for sustainable development, or is there a lot more to be done?
I think, to make it short, we have progressed, but a lot has to be done. So what are the facts? I think within Germany we had an intense discussion after the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals to organize a process within Germany. And we needed 2 years to discuss a certain structure. And in 2017, it was the first time after 40 years of non-discussion between the state levels, the federal government, and the Länder, who are responsible for culture and education, that we adopted, together with the representatives of the non-governmental organizations, with the social partners, the communities, a common paper to organize education for sustainable development in the future. And I think this was very important. So the UNESCO Global Action Program stimulated the discussion in Germany, and we see now in my talks with the responsible ministers for culture in the Länder, in the German states, that there is a huge increase in curriculum reform. And the main line is that we have to say goodbye to the silos thinking. We have in teacher training and in students training. So we need within the education process new interlinkages. We need an orientation away from a national view to the planet vision, as was told in the introductory speeches. So I think this is half the way to change the pillars of thinking or the orientation of thinking. But we need a support by the international discussion, and this discussion takes place within UNESCO, and we are encouraged in UNESCO by the General Assembly of the United Nations, which said that UNESCO has to deliver, I like to say, has to deliver within the 17 goals, because it was said just before, it's not only goal 4, but education is a pillar to realize the other 16 goals as well. So I think this has been a milestone. What we are doing now and what we are lacking is we need in all states of the world, we need multi-stakeholder nationwide activities to organize a dialogue between state and state representatives and the civil society. And this is a new understanding also in the political scene, because up to now, the states all around the world reclaim for themselves, I would even say to dictate what is useful and what has to be taught in in schools, in universities, and so on. And this is at the same time when education for sustainable development takes place, that at the same time a changing of the heart of the society, of our understanding of the society. This facilitates at the same time and makes more severe the whole process.
Thank you very much. Menti Morales, you and Professor Bacher are co-chairs of the program committee. With regard to our key topic here at the conference, namely empowering children to become creators of solutions in sustainable development, what did you and other members of the committee consider especially important? What should we be keeping in mind now for the next 2 days?
Well, there are several things. I think that first of all, understanding why is so important STEM education or inquiry-based education, STEM education for sustainable development. Definitely through this, children and students in general and people can understand why it's so important and why this will allow them, to be really citizens, ethical citizens that use science for the sustainability of the world, and as well understands that technology, for example, is a tool and not the end of something, So I think that that is very, very important, understanding the why, understanding then the how, because how you land this in a classroom, taking into consideration the different context, you as a teacher must be capable enough to understand their role in this moment. They are not now the traditional teachers, they are the 21st century teachers. So that is very, very important as well. And another thing is that the integration of areas through STEM for sustainable development will allow everyone to be really problem solvers, and problem solvers of their contexts, using these areas of content, developing skills, competences, capacities, and vinculating emotionally as well with their context. That means being a citizen, a real human being, related to the context where they are responsible for that. I think it's very, very important. The whole thing you're going to see in the position paper that has been a really great effort.
Yeah,
and that is something.
That's a wonderful lead-in to our discussion later on today about key messages in the position paper. So thank you very much for that. Dagmar Wolf, let me ask you, because you told us Bosch Stiftung, which is, for those who don't know it, one of the major corporate foundations in Europe. Bosch doesn't focus explicitly on STEM, but it does focus on early education. You also are realigning your programs at the moment to shift your focus of concentration in a fascinating way. And I know one of your big topics is also inequality. So would you just draw that link, if you would, between why you're supporting this conference on STEM and how that fits into your program, including the concentration on inequality? Because of course we know sustainability is not only about environmental sustainability, but very much about social sustainability.
Well, education is highly related to many fields of our lives: economic status, civic participation. And this week's PISA shows us the socio-economic background of a child is decisive for educational success, and we do have a lack in Germany here. And high-quality education in early childhood, as well as later on in schools, is the key to create equal opportunities across our society, and this is why we are in this field. And it's very important to strengthen the German education. Walter Hiche also said it, we need to have collaboration. In Germany, we also have to have collaboration between the 16 federal states, which is really a problem in education. We have to prepare young people to face the challenges of tomorrow, and we have to enhance equal opportunities in our schools, in our early childhood institutions. And therefore, we focus on organizational development of educational institutions. This is also what we do with Haus der kleinen Forscher. And as foundation, we also invest in high quality learning and in the education of early childhood institutions. This is how we work. We do this with several different projects, but this is how we are engaged in this field.
Thank you very much. Vito Cicera, the Federal Foreign Office is also supporting the conference, the IDoS conference. So I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about how it fits into Germany's foreign policy in general in regard to sustainability. I know Germany now says it has essentially a diplomacy for sustainability, so maybe you can draw that link.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having this here. Thank you to the Little Researchers House for organizing this conference, because this conference and other platforms like this fit very good in our concept of foreign cultural and educational policy, which is part of the German foreign policy. We call it the third column, the third pillar of German foreign policy. Next to traditional bilateral relationships we try to develop with other countries and the foreign trade policy. Foreign cultural and educational policy is part of German foreign policy, and what we want is to open spaces for discussion, to open spaces for knowledge, to open spaces for understanding about the problems. We try to get in contact and to keep the contact to civil societies, because we are convinced that we have to discuss about the problems of the present and of the future. And so this is part of our foreign policy to support this platforms like this. As we do it during our membership in the United Nations Security Council, when we are talking about peace and security in the world, we do this also with our membership in the UNESCO Executive Board, where we talk about education skills, about developments in knowledges about STEM or other parts of education. So this is the whole picture of German foreign policy, to be engaged, to be involved also in these parts of the political discussion about the questions of the future. And therefore, this is for us a very deep commitment we want to give to partners like, for example, the Little Researchers House, that we are engaged in this, and that we want to support those platforms here.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at my watch, and we're almost out of time with our discussion window, but let me do this. I'm going to throw out my specific questions that I had for each of you, and put one question to all of you with the request for a 3-sentence answer, max. And the question is this: what are the most important next steps in this area, particularly in regard to international collaboration? So 3 sentences, please. Well, to go straight down the panel from starting here. Mete.
I think that international cooperation should invest in the territories, in the strategic territorial strategy that has been installed in several countries in the world. Siemens Stiftung has made a really great effort to install these territories in Latin America, and we have great networks that are working together cooperatively and that are doing STEM projects that need financing. Mm-hmm. I think the same happens in Africa, but in Latin America is a special need, and we have great effort there, so we can escalate.
Okay, thank you. Walter.
Sorry.
I think 3 things. First, I repeat, we should initiate nationwide multi-stakeholder initiatives in all states of the world. Second, UNESCO should support more the single states in their special needs. And third, I think we have to concentrate on a new training of teachers and educators worldwide, because we now know it's the person who transports things, aims, goals, visions, and so on, and we need a revaluation. I say this in viewing the German situation, especially a re-evaluation of the teachers and educators as those responsible more than others for the future of the society and the future of the next generations.
Thank you. Yokabi?
To me, I think within the international cooperation, space and STEM, I think the most important thing is collaboration that's based on goodwill. I think a lot of people go in with their own agendas, and this skews the process. So I think the bottom line should be that we're doing this for children and for the provision of quality life to all. So if we go with that view, I think it would change some of the narratives and some of the problems that we're experiencing.
So the people who were hugging to show the SDG on partnership were right on track with that.
But there has to be goodwill.
Okay. Well, I think STEM has to be at the beginning of an educational biography, which we, as the Federal Foreign Office, try to support with a link to Germany. Because STEM is a key for the understanding of global problems and for supporting actions which are necessary to solve those problems. And therefore, I think it is important to foster this, to support this, because especially in a time where we can observe a rising skepticism in science and research as a whole.
Thank you. Dr.
And
Wolf.
according to this, we have to find good preschools and schools, and we have to bring them out as an innovative role model for other schools. We do have good schools, we do have good preschools, and we have to show this to the public. And we also have to build networks to facilitate the transfer of knowledge and the expansion of required skills to effective schools and preschools.
So sharing best practices and lighthouses and exactly what we're going to be doing here for the next day and a half. So many, many thanks to all of you. Let's give them a warm round of applause. And I'll ask you to take your seats, if you would. And ladies and gentlemen, before I introduce our keynote speaker, may I just say this would be a great moment to take out those journals. We are now getting some inputs that I think can be interesting and useful as we continue exploring our conference theme. If you take a look at your journal, you will find a page in your journal that's in your little packet around your necks entitled, "This is what I want to learn over the next 2 days." And that might be a good place to start, maybe. And by the way, we will take audience questions at the end of the keynote. So again, this is a page where you could make notes on what you're about to hear, if you were so inclined. And let me also note that we will be web streaming this keynote on the English website of the Haus der Kleinen Forscher. So at the risk now of stating what may seem self-evident to an audience as informed as you are, let me just underline one crucial premise that is implicit in the link between STEM and sustainability. To meet the challenges that we face, ranging from the climate crisis to social inequality, we must find a way to catalyze collective behavioral change. We must prepare future generations for roles in which they adapt to change, design for change, manage change, govern for change. Our keynote speaker is a widely recognized international expert on processes of societal transformation. His keynote is entitled "Launching Children on Pathways to Sustainable Futures with Curiosity," was mentioned just now in our discussion, the importance of curiosity, and STEM learning. Please welcome the head of Strategic Science Initiatives and Programs and scientific project leader at the renowned Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies here in Potsdam, outside of Berlin, Professor Dr. Ilan Chabay. The floor is yours. Welcome. Thank you.
So, give me a moment to get the presentation up. I think we're almost there. Well, whoops. There we go. Okay. This is always an interesting process of coordination. If I can find my cursor. on the screen. Wait a minute, where are we? There we go. Okay, so I need to dismiss this, and I'm just trying to find, there we are. Okay. Whoa. Sorry about that. That was not what I intended to do, but I will get there yet. Okay. Okay. Apologize for that. So, it is a great pleasure to be here and to meet with all of you. Already had several very interesting talks, and certainly very much already talk about some of the issues that I'd like to explain and explore a little further with you. But it's also a great pleasure and a great honor to have the chance to meet with you, and I very much appreciate the opportunity, thanks to the sponsors and to the Haus der Kleinen Forscher for allowing me to come and join you in this wonderful adventure, which I think is a really crucial thing for us to really focus on and pay attention at the early childhood level, but also as part of a coherent strategy of learning across the not only early childhood but lifelong learning, as I will talk a little more about. But I think the point is that how do we, and I use the word very specifically, how do we launch children into the world that they will inherit, that they have, in a way that helps them engage with the rather important, not only crucial, but important to them aspects of a changing world that they are suddenly confronted with. And they enter into the world with their parents, but they see a little piece of this. As they get older, this expands until, in some sense, they begin to understand that wonderful blue marble that Natalie von Siemens showed to begin with as almost an icon of what we face. So very briefly, the flow of what I want to talk about, first of all, is that we really are addressing an urgent and existential challenge. And that is really, how do we move towards just and equitable, sustainable futures? I hesitate to use the term sustainable development, to be honest. I really like to think of it in the different cultures and contexts of the world as the sustainable futures each of us, each community, each nation, etc., need to find. Development is a bit of a loaded term. One can understand what it means, and one then has to be a bit careful about how one uses it. But sustainable futures, I think, also addresses this. Critical point is that we, humanity, all of us, are part of a complex social ecological system. We are not apart from it, as many would like to see us. We are fundamentally in the middle of it. So we need to think about the complexity, and we need to think about collective behavior change, as has already been said. It is great if you take out your garbage and separate the plastic and the glass and so forth. Wonderful. If you wear your seatbelt, whatever it is, individually. But that's not sufficient. We need the collective action of groups, of communities, of nations, of the globe, if we are going to deal with the problem of the scale and criticality that we now face. We need those strategies for dealing with collective behavior change and the Sustainable Development Goals as an indication of that. They're one way to package that, but there are many other ways, which we'll talk a bit about. And we need, for that, to learn to design for change, not to fix what's broken only, but to design for new futures which will come upon us whether we want to or not. And we need to think about how STEM learning is not just about the science, technology, engineering, and math, but as was already said, it's about the values and, in a sense, the ways of looking and appreciating and engaging with the world around us. And with that, the understanding, the agency, and the commitment to making a real impact here. So let me talk a little bit about the context. Well, I rather like this sign. We have entered the Anthropocene. That is the term that Paul Crutzen and Gene Sturmer gave around the year 2000 to the fact that we as humanity have been making and continue to make changes to our total environment, to that little blue planet, and now beyond it, in fact, that are on the scale of large-scale geological changes. There are markers in the Earth at the layers at which we can see that humanity has shown up. We're no longer isolated from the effect on the entire globe. We see it, but the problem is we can't just say, we got a problem, let's go back. Forget it. Ain't happening. There are some I could name in the political sphere, being an American especially, who seem to think that that's what we should be doing, but I think those here quite easily recognize that's not one of our options, nor is it a desirable in my view. So what does this come from? One of the arguments that really underlies this, and started with the limits to growth of Club of Rome, but has been updated with the planetary boundaries that was really developed around 2009, has been developed also in other forms. But the point is that we have increasing population, we have increasing impact on the planet, and the point is there are limits to critical resources. It is not an infinite resource, the planet we live on. And even if one likes to think very broadly about, okay, we're going to go and mine asteroids and we're going to, populate Mars, come on, we've got to still live here, one, and two, this is a very long-term process, and then the question comes, what happens on these other places as well? So these are not solutions that we can just escape our problem here, now, and in the future. But the other part of that limits is perhaps the more critical piece, and that is the tipping points. So it's not just that we may run out of some stuff, or that we may have climate change as such, and you got to get used to having a warmer climate. No, the point is that we can reach, and we are close to that, a tipping point at which we cannot go back and we cannot survive. So it is existential. Are we going to be here as a species or aren't we? And how are we going to do that? The other thing which comes up, as I said, it's not only existential, it's urgent. So it's not only that we have these issues, but that from these, and I don't know how well you can see it, but the point is that from about 1950, these are a set of both social, ecological, social economic indicators on the far side and the Earth system indicators on the near side. All of them show an inflection point that basically takes off around 1950. Not so important whether it's exactly then or not. The point is there's an acceleration. And these graphs of Will Steffen and others really remind us that we don't have a lot of time to mess with this, because we're in such a rate of change where we have to be very quick in our development and innovation. In prior times, this was not so much the case for a couple of reasons. One, because things were more localized, at least what we were aware of. So it was easier to deal with it. We don't have that option now. Things are globalized. Things reach across boundaries. And when it changes rapidly, we can't just fix the local problem and say, we're done, fine. Because in fact, we are affected by others and they by us. I'll get back to more of that shortly. So we have the planetary boundary argument. We have the acceleration of these indicators. And we have perhaps a nice way of putting those together to look at the safe and just space for humanity. And it's sort of pulled together by Kate Rayworth's, what she calls donut, or I would say a set of circles, with the inside being the social boundaries involving gender equality, political voice, peace and justice, health, food, etc. And on the outside, the planetary boundaries, the boundaries of the social, biological, geophysical system. And somewhere in between there is where we've got to go. We've got to be in that to be able to survive. So that leads us to the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been already talked about, and I'm sure everybody's familiar. But I think the important idea, again, is that that is a representation of what we think collectively at this point, many of us, are the guidelines for a safe and just space for humanity. Question is, okay, that's cool. How do we get there? What do we do? Yes, we have 169 targets, a whole set of things that we have laid out from that, but we actually don't know how to get there. What are the strategies we need to be able to move towards this? One can also say, as I said, these are the 17 goals. What's really critical about this in thinking about it is that they aren't 17 separate goals. We cannot go to the usual 19th century or even earlier Enlightenment, separation, silos, reductionist view, because it is a complex system. We are embedded in that system. We can't take some scissors and cut out each one and say, okay, you do this one, I'll do that one. It's helpful for thinking about it, but it doesn't work. So if I want to change something with the energy system, it will impact people in terms of equity. It will require education and maintenance. It will require that there is a source of water for cooling of a system. I mean, there are many different ways in which these begin to interact. So we're at the point that we have to deal with the complexity of the real social ecological system. And what I don't want to get to leave you with is this idea, oh my God, this is so complicated and complex, I don't know how to do anything. No, it's in fact, that's where the STEM education becomes critical. How do we begin to understand complexity as a fundamental part of our lives in a way that's simple? Sounds oxymoronic, but in fact, it's not. And I'll try to get to some examples of that quite specifically. But the point is that there are these interdependencies of these SDGs, and we need to think about how do we actually work with that and begin to understand why a complex system is difficult for us to work with. One of the reasons it's difficult for us as humans to work with is that we have very limited working memory. We can mess with half a dozen variables in our head at any one time. I sometimes feel lucky if I can manage 2, but we can't deal with thousands. We simply can't do it. And therefore, we need tools, we need ways, strategies to work with a complex system. And we cannot just pass it off to someone else. We all need to look at that. But one of the consequences of complexity is that you don't always know. In fact, very often I would say it's more the exception where you know what the cause is of a phenomenon or that you may have initiated. So you do something, but in fact the cause is somewhere else in space and time. There is something that is done today that may show up in a microsecond, right here, but it might show up in a century on the other side of the globe. That means we don't always know what we've done or the effect of it. So we're used to, in a sense, thinking, well, I know cause and effect. That's what we're taught, and STEM education does that. But that's a fallacy when one's talking about a complex system. It doesn't work that way. So I have a silly way of thinking about it, but it's maybe not entirely silly, namely that causality is a casualty of the consequence of complexity. So we've lost, if you will, if we're honest, we've lost this nice, simple connection, linear connection between cause and effect. So we need to have other tools to think about these events. One of them is to think about trends and correlations, and not just about the causes. Now, that's dangerous in another way, because very often people confuse correlation and cause. Absolutely. But on the other hand, one can also look at correlations and begin to see to what degree are there identifiable and verifiable drivers or causes of those correlations. But the correlations are a very good place to start looking. It's important to use the best available and contextually appropriate knowledge, and then expect to refine it. One of the misunderstandings, and again, the importance of STEM education, is the idea of what is science. It's not about, oh, I got the right answer, done, we can leave now. No, we are constantly attempting to fix it, or in fact, to be more precise, we attempt to falsify it. We have an idea how something works, we can create a theory, and then we try to break it. And we have to try hard, rather than trying to say, oh, well, it works fine. I have one example of somebody walking in a single file, so everybody must walk in single files. Well, sorry, no. We have to embrace continual, adaptive, and anticipatory governance, not just reactions to what has happened or the desire to go back to what was somewhere else. So let me talk a little bit more about systems, sustainability, and society. And one of the critical pieces, which I already mentioned, is the idea that sustainability is embedded in the natural systems. We cannot escape from, we are part of it, and we are entirely dependent on those ecological natural systems. Somebody says, oh, the ecology and the environment, yes, there's a very nice forest about a kilometer over there. Well, no, wait a minute, what are you breathing? What are you drinking? What are you wearing? You're in the middle of it. You're a part of it. What's also important is that societies define what is relevant and valuable in the local and global environment. It's not given to us. Each society, each culture actually defines things differently. Do you value the plants on the ground, the earth, the materials around you, or is technology, the devices, the built environment the most valuable thing? Do you see the connections? So we have to be aware that that is a cultural and a contextual issue, and address that directly. So as a result, policies and practice have to address those values in that context, not just look for technical optimization. That's important in another sense from the STEM education perspective, that we're not just looking for the one right answer. You know, find it in the chapter in the book. You know, what's the right answer? Well, in many of these cases, again, because of the complexity and the values, there may be many answers, or maybe there's no one good answer, but we have to find what is viable in the context, in the situation that we're dealing with. Sustainability, thus, depends on values, depends on a sense of agency, the ability to act on something. And that, again, has already been said, that's an important thing that STEM brings into the learning process early on. And from understanding this in this larger context, to remember and develop a commitment to the responsibility to act. And as Dr. Fritz mentioned earlier, it's not just about learning something, understanding it, but enabling somebody to act on it. So rapid changes require us to continually learn. We're not done. You leave school and you think, okay, I got it all, forget it. We will all need to keep learning. Besides which, that's the most fun that I can think of, at least for me. But it's also about designing about the future, not just letting it happen to us. And to innovate, not just for the market, but for societal needs, and to drive that as a value. So that comes back to something mentioned earlier today already, and I'll come back. Collective behavior change is what's really the key challenge. How do we get to that? Well, one is a wonderful example. You know, let's really engage as a social movement. And one of the things that I'm very interested in is the dynamics of social movements, particularly towards sustainability and the collective actions. So we have the wonderful example of youth going out and saying, wait a minute, we need something now, not in 50 years or whatever. We need it now. And to actually engage the commitment that shows and the insight saying, let's do this now. And we need all of us as part of this. One part of it that I just mentioned is the KLASICA, is the interest that I have and that a group of us work on in terms of research on the nature of collective behavior change, how that happens in different cultures and contexts, and to try to understand what is in common among these kinds of phenomena of social movements and their dynamics. How do they develop? How do they fall apart, which they do also? What keeps them together? What are the important pieces? And one of the important links that I've been trying to explore, and I mention because I think we all, in all the cultures and countries that are present so wonderfully here, we have narratives, we have stories, we have images, We have dance. We use those both to create community, to give a sense of community, but also to express visions. Where are we going? What do we want in our society? And that is part of what I'm very interested in, using these kind of efforts here. So what are strategies for sustainability? The other major project which I co-direct is on global systems for, Global Sustainability Strategy Forum, in which we're trying to understand what do we actually need as strategies in society. We've had a number of meetings. We will have the next one in Washington, D.C. at my offices at Arizona State, and the one after that in Bangkok at the, in conjunction with a UN Asian Summit on sustainability in late March, and then in in October 2020 in Hanover, a kind of summary of what we're trying to do with this. And the major points that we came back with from the Global Sustainability Strategy Forum first meeting in March of this year was that the process of learning to design for change is really crucial for this. Mention that a little more on this. Again, complex system science itself, in terms of the academic domains, is an important and essential piece of this. It's a focus about changing the dynamics in society that drive unsustainability, rather than trying to fix what's broken already. Because we've already been acting unsustainably, and yes, we need to mitigate, to adapt, but if we only do that and don't figure out how we go forward and actually change those patterns, we will keep just being behind the game, trying to catch up and fix what we keep breaking. We need to learn from the past to understand our present, yes, but then to use that in designing for the future. Now let me come to the educational aspect of it. We need to build the education for transformative complex systems research, but also for, again, for society broadly, the whole society, to understand what this is about, why we care about this aspect. And one of those aspects that as a scientist I have run into, I should maybe mention that I've had 3 careers. I started out doing laser physics and chemistry, had a fabulous time, loved it, but then my questions changed, and I got an opportunity to run a science museum with Frank Oppenheimer, the brother of Robert Oppenheimer, in San Francisco, a place called the Exploratorium, and the questions changed, and rather than going back to Stanford, I said, I'm going to start focusing on this, because in fact, on one hand, scientists don't engage with society very effectively, if at all, and on the other hand, society doesn't understand what the science is doing and why it is part of their lives. So I wanted to develop ways to engage people, not in teaching pieces of science. That's fine, but that wasn't my goal. My goal was, how do we engage people in these kind of questions we are talking about today? And I started in 1985. And it's also about understanding that science is a normative process. It's not objective in the sort of classical sense. And boy, I've had some of my colleagues, get ready to start a fight with me about it. And they, no, it's about the truth. And my reaction is, yeah, and how do you know? What is the truth? It's about the best we can do, and to understand that we make choices. Who's funding it? Who benefits from the research? Who gets harmed by it? Who chooses who gets the funding and what we do with it? So it is normative. And that's a good thing in the sense that that's also about why we want to work on sustainability instead of something else or just something else. It's not that traditional areas of science are not important. They're absolutely necessary, and the narrow specificity and depth of disciplinary science is essential. It may be necessary, but it is not sufficient. So we need a broader sense, and we need the engagement not only natural science, but social science. We need arts, we need humanities, philosophy, law, theology. All of that has to be part of this story. And it's also a process of engaging with the people who are affected by what we do or who affect it, who influence it. So co-design, co-producing knowledge. And that means trying to organize mutual learning dialogues with people. So not just about, let me come and tell you about all the right things, you know, like me standing up here. No, it's about really thinking together, which is what we're going to do in the next few days, and this is really just a kind of a teaser to open some questions up. But it's really about learning together, because there is this, if you will, the idea of the experts. I don't like the term experts in that sense, because we are all experts only in a little piece, if that, and we are all learners in everything else. And that's where we should be, and that's fine. So there's, if you will, a kind of humility of science, to steal a bit of Sheila Jasanoff's comment about the technology of humility. So what does this mean, dialogues for mutual learning? Let me give you some examples. Things like tales and rituals are ways of learning from narrative expressions, not just strings of words, images, wonderful songs, music, dance. So this tales, folk tales of Chizu, a small town in southwest Japan, where I had the good fortune to go visit with a colleague that worked there. And the rituals, I'm sorry, these are probably very hard to see because it's pretty washed out with the light. I'll show you later on the computer. But the point is that these rituals are not just, okay, somebody doing the same thing each year. It's about the coherence of the community, and it's about an appreciation of the role of the community in shaping their futures. So, for example, this community had serious problems with earthquakes, landslides, the tsunami, you name it, and volcanoes, etc. But they also had the problem of loss of aging population and loss of population. So they began to come together, thanks to the work of my colleague Norio Okada, 30 years ago, and build a structure to design for the future. Really, really impressive. Another wonderful example in Taiwan, in a Majia township, where an entire set of local communities were basically wiped out by a landslide. I think it was 2010, I forgot exactly. Anyway, and they ended up moving those different tribes together, so they are now living in one community, all four of these tribes, but sharing their own sort of origin myths, all going to one school, living in this one community with the tribal chieftains, like this woman in the lower corner there, with this carving of their story, the story of their tribe, but they're sharing it now. And they're using that to help the children see their role in the community and their way forward. A couple of examples, one from the Arctic Council meeting, Arctic Circle meeting, where we gathered a group of people, both business, national governments, local tribal leaders from all over the Arctic. And again, it was really about learning from each other, with each other, and being able to address what are quite complex issues. And also, the Arctic is one of those places where the whole question of climate change is inescapable, in your face every day. So it's provocative. The other picture, the lower picture, is from a earthquake recovery discussion near Kumamoto, Japan, after the earthquake in 2016. So what are some strategies about design for change? I mean, yes, you can think about how do you think about the future? Well, you can read Jules Verne, and you can read, all kinds of wonderful efforts like that from art. But art in general then is a very effective way of both reflecting on our society, but also creating from that images of the future. And that's gone on for a long time. This isn't new. But we need to learn from that and use it as imaginaries of the future in a very relevant way. We need to play, and I emphasize that word, play, not only as little children, which certainly is critical, but as adults, with these ideas. And the idea that Stuart Kaufman first brought up for evolutionary biology of the adjacent possible is something that some colleagues and I in Rome, Vittorio Loreto in particular, have adopted in thinking about collective actions towards creativity. So how do you expand your own adjacent possible? You engage with other people, and you begin to think, how are they thinking about this? How can I share my ideas? And soon, your little bubble of the adjacent possible has become a bigger bubble and a bigger bubble. And we begin to find other ways to think about design for change. And whimsy, humor, funny things are fabulous stuff. There was this one moment I was doing the Frozen Bubble exhibit, which I'll show you later, an activity with a group of kids. They were second grade, so they were 7, 8 years old, 9 years old. I think it was in Salt Lake City years ago. And I had about 60 kids in the room, and the teachers, and a couple of parents. And at some point, I had bubbles coming up from some dry ice, and there's a very nice white cloud on top, and I dropped some green dye in the water, and the bottom turns green, and the top stays white. And so I asked them, what do you think happened? So I got a whole bunch of wonderful answers, but the best was one little kid puts up his hand and says, it's the little green men that are holding it. I said, wow, cool. And I'm looking, I can't see him. He looks at me, oh no, you can't see them. I thought, oh, okay, I get it. But what was really instructive is, I mean, everybody laughed, it was great. The teachers came to me, and one of the parents too, and said, that's terrible. You didn't tell him he's wrong. I said, come on. It was this wonderful bit of whimsy. And if we want to play with that, let's do that. Nobody is going home convinced they're little green men in this glass of water. But everybody goes away, oh, I wonder how else I could think about that. That's the point of the whimsy. that leads to something really critical in this, and that I want to emphasize in terms of STEM education, but education in general. We have a long history of teaching with the results of models, but we don't teach about the models. We say, this is the answer. This is the way it works. Well, wait a minute. Where do we get that? How do we get to that understanding? What kind of a model? And I don't mean very deep computational models. I mean very simple things in many cases. If I take a ball and I throw it to you, you know roughly where to put your hands. You're not calculating that. You have a very simple model in your head. Good baseball players, I understand, have a very good model of how to watch the object so they know where to go. Well, that's a model also. If I show you a phenomenon that surprises you and that isn't familiar, you probably start guessing, wait a minute, how'd you do that? You watch, something happens. Wait a minute, how'd that happen? So you begin to form a mental model. And we can elaborate on that and more on that later, but I think it's a way of exploring ideas safely. You don't have to blow up the kitchen to try the experiment, but it allows you to do that experiment. Modeling in certain ways offers something very important also that the usual scientific models don't. If you write a system dynamics model for the climate, let's say, or any of a number of phenomena, you are writing what you expect, what you have observed will happen. You have a projection because you have a mathematical expression for that. And whether you solve that analytically or you solve it computationally doesn't matter. On the other hand, if you use what is called agent-based models, where emergent phenomena may pop up that you didn't explicitly plan for, then we have a chance to think differently about it. It's not necessarily right. It's not necessarily predictive, but at least it says, wait a minute, something could happen here that we weren't waiting for, we weren't expecting. And I think we could think of a few examples in our world today that fit that rather well. So using models, games, objects as boundary objects in dialogues and conflicts is quite important, so that we are able to use this to talk about things together. I will just skip quickly over this, but in workshops on design, one of the things is, what is it that allows people to share a common idea in some broad way, but then to elaborate together on that common idea, object, game, model, and develop from that. Let me then conclude with a few remarks and few examples on STEM learning specifically. Again, unfortunately, images aren't working very well, but we can maybe return to that when people want. The thing is, how do we reconfigure education to form a coherent trajectory of learning from early childhood through lifelong learning, and to see it as part of this coherent lifelong trajectory that we all learn? And the approach to STEM education for sustainability is one about changing expectations in society, all of societies, plural, about what is learning and what is science as part of that. To stimulate curiosity and inquiry, as has already been wonderfully elaborated. I would say also building a vocabulary for thinking. That is, to have experiences that give you a concrete instance that you can play with in your mind to think about something else. And those are really very, very important things. And STEM education is wonderful because it gives children the real concrete experience. Very briefly, I'll mention that I did an experiment when I was part of the Aspen Center for Science. A bunch of colleagues, several with Nobel Prizes in physics and chemistry, and directly across from my office was Dick Feynman and people at Murray Gell-Mann, etc. I went around, I did a survey, and asked them to tell me the first thing that came to their mind when I posed a simple, in this case, molecular scattering problem. And the interesting thing is, everyone with one exception, notable one, of those 20 answered with childhood experiences with simple objects, marbles or baseball or soccer. It was all using that as the starting point. I mean, they absolutely know that was not the end point, but that's the first image that came to their mind. And I think that's what we are building on with the STEM education at early childhood, is to give them those tools, a vocabulary for thinking in those ways. And making models and building them explicit, I already mentioned. Also experiences that transcend culture and language. The wonderful thing about some of these physical devices, and I've invented a couple of hundred of them in 230 museums around the world, and Disney and NASA and all that, you don't need a specific language. They've worked in all cultures and all languages. And it's allowing also for discussion among peers. The kids talk to each other about this. Not to me, I mean, that's fine too, but how much more wonderful when it becomes a discussion between them about what they're seeing and they're interpreting and learning to collaborate, to communicate, and to become effective with that. Oh, I see. All right. So one quick example, thanks to my wife, Lori Adams Chabay, who's director of a Early Learning Center. This is from an earlier work that she did at the World Bank Children's Center as director of education there, of kids designing a building by looking at some pictures of the building, deciding they were going to draw it, and Ananya, I think it was, decided she's going to do the Washington Monument. And so she drew that, and then they're sitting there discussing it with each other, not with the teacher, with each other, and actually created, I don't know if this is at all visible, created a blueprint. And one of the things about the blueprint, which I loved, was that, well, it has to have a pointy thing on top. So what they ended up doing is deciding which blocks do they need, and how are you going to put it together? And they sat and worked together to figure out, even before building it, they planned it, and they put it together. What a fantastic, he said, these are 4-year-olds. Come on, if they can do it, we ought to be able to do it, no? Very quickly, because of, I think time is running late, I've developed lots of these exhibits and games, and I'd love to share with you. I don't know how well they'll show up, but using the beauty of nature, real phenomena, and surprise, cognitive dissonance to engage people. Not starting with information, I'll tell you about such and such, but something, then people go, whoa, wait, what is it? How do you do that? At that point, you have a conversation you can start. So let me give you an example with the flow tunnel. It's about 4 meters across, and it's just a picture with women and their daughters playing with it in Chile and Santiago. They're controlling shapes inside this thin tunnel with magnets on the outside, but they're also discussing it. They're talking about what's happening because each of them can work on it themselves. They're capable. But you get absolutely, and I'm sorry this doesn't come out, but really beautiful, strikingly beautiful phenomena. And you can also have something where you have 2 shapes and you have high turbulence. You simply move one shape and the other, and all of a sudden the turbulence is gone. And I could show you a video of that, but it has nowhere near the impact than when you do the experiment and you play with it. Well, what if I turned it a little more this way? Or what if I did that? Now you know it's real. It's not something somebody just made up. You can even fly an aircraft wing in there, and I could tell you stories about that, but I won't. The next piece that I really would love to stress is the frozen bubble box, which is really a way of getting people to participate in the process of science. With this, you can deal with chemistry, biology, physics, global ocean acidification, global warming, many things. But it starts, and I don't know if it's visible at all, but the expressions on the kids' faces on the top, on the right there, and the adults' faces there in Beijing is like that. I mean, they're just total, like, wait a minute. Well, at that point, you can't stop the questions. And then you have the opportunity to begin really exploring. Now, I will also say that this kind of thing, it's so simple. I mean, I've done it in, I don't know, 15 or 20 countries, different conditions, anything with a cardboard box and some saran wrap or plastic wrap to a bathtub to an old aquarium. But it allows you to really explore things, and it's again about model making. So people say, oh, this happens because you blew the bubble with hot air and that's why they're floating. Okay, cool, let's try it. What could we do to test it? Eventually somebody, well, can you blow it with cold air? Sure, have a little squeeze bulb, blow it with cold air, not my ample supply of hot air. It still floats. Oh, we gotta fix the model. And we go on from there. Very briefly, a German exhibition that Ortwin Renn and I designed for Baden-Württemberg that now I heard it's something like 700,000 people have gone through over the past 6 years or so, in which I also designed a game in the middle on the Energiewende. Again, not to teach specifics, but to open the questions, whether young children or adults. And I won't have time to go into that. Again, lots of different ways of doing this, all have that purpose. One slide which I really love, and I don't know if you can see it, in the top is a group of kindergarten children playing with a toy that I built 35 years ago or whatever, and the same, literally the same physical device being used by Paul Crutzen, who coined this term, the Anthropocene, among many other things. And he was asked by Klaus Tupfer, the, at that time, director of the institute where I am, Paul, would you please sit down? We have to start the meeting again. He said, no, wait, I have to try this. And the same thing that these kids are doing as they're talking to each other. So very briefly, let me summarize all of this. We're dealing with urgent existential issues, not a small problem, and not one that any nation, any individual, any single approach can address, but what we need to address collectively. Second, we are dealing with complex social ecological systems, so that the tools that we have developed since the Enlightenment of science are not adequate by in and of themselves to address this. We need to reach beyond that. We need to focus on collective behavior change and empowering communities to work together in that way. We need to think about designing for change, and we need to think really about new approaches that really use the power of STEM learning at all ages, including adults, to help engage with these issues. So, is this the end? Well, yes, of my talk, but no, we've only taken the first steps towards sustainable futures, and I hope we will continue to move together. So thank you for thinking with me.
Thank you, Ilan Chabay. We started late, so we are behind in the time. Let me first look to the organizer to say, shall we still take 1 or 2 questions? Okay. Then we're going to shorten our coffee break, and we're also going to shorten our networking session after that, and that way we're going to try to get back on time. So let's take a couple of audience questions. Who would like to pose one? We have microphones in the room, and here I have one. I'm going to bundle them. I'll take those 2 then. Go ahead, please.
Quick question. Carol O'Donnell from the Smithsonian in the USA. We have a tendency to use the term socio-scientific issues. I also see you use socio-ecological. Same premise, but the idea of scientific expands beyond ecological. How important is it that we think specifically about socio-ecological versus socio-scientific?
Okay, thank you. Let me take one other and then we'll bundle.
That's fine.
Can we take the one in the, yeah.
Yeah, Gramseger, Free University of Berlin. The vast majority of the leaders and the engineers and the soldiers who invented and constructed and executed in the 1940s the Holocaust were highly educated people. And the vast majority of the political leaders who in the past 30 years from now destroyed our planet were highly educated people. How can we hope that education can change anything? And wouldn't these leaders of today laugh at us when we answer with art, with play of ideas, with whimsy, imagination and humor, with employing models and scenarios to explore ideas safely?
Let's do those 2. And then,
Okay, wonderful questions. Thank you, both. Let me maybe start with your question about the socio-scientific versus socio-ecological. I think the difficulty both terms is that people don't understand them unless the people are already engaged in some of this. If you use this in a public environment where people are not primed for this, neither term probably works very well. From my own point of view, I do appreciate the idea of it socio-scientific, but what the ecological aspect emphasizes is the human inextricability from the ecological environment. That so much of the failure from my perspective that we are trying to get out of is the lack of understanding of the deep interdependence and dependence on the overall ecological system. So I would still prefer the socio-ecological, but it's not that I don't understand the other terminology, but I think it carries a slightly different tone to it and connotation with it. To the second question, in a sense, can education change anything, and the leaders in particular? My answer is yes. I mean, I'm very aware of all aspects of this question in terms of the Holocaust and beyond, for many reasons. But the responsibility we have, which I think we are trying to address here in different ways, and there are others who are addressing it in other ways, is to gain the involvement of a broader segment of population in understanding that simple solutions to complex problems don't work. And so the simplistic response that someone else is responsible for the problems you're having with the economy, or because they're migrants coming in and they're taking the jobs, when we look at that data, what's really interesting, and I can speak to this from the US, it is not the people who have had immigrants in their neighborhood. It's the people who haven't, and they are afraid. And if we let that kind of fear and lack of understanding of the interaction and the interdependence we are all subject to, if we cannot bring that into the education, then yes, indeed, we'll fail. But if we can, I think we can be quite optimistic.
Thank you. One more, sure. We'll take that one as well, and then we'll take a break.
I'm Pierre Léna from France. You have extremely well underlined the importance of interdependencies in this new scheme of education. The classical STEM has followed more or less the analytical attitude of science, where we simplify the problem, isolate one or two parameters, and solve it. I think it needs a next step in STEM, which will think of pedagogical circumstances and devices to outline the understanding of interdependency, of systemic approach of any physical or chemical or biological system. I think this is a new step for the classical STEM. What do you think of that?
Thank you for that question. I completely agree. And I think, you know, again, it is not about teaching pieces of the science. We can do that. We've been very good at that. But it's about changing those premises about what, in fact, is incorporated into that learning of science, and of science in a much broader context. So let me give you two little examples of where this can go. For example, using a set of Legos, a table, with augmented reality. We did some prototypes. It's now actually been running several months in the Barbican Museum in London, and now it will be set up in Groningen, Netherlands, where people create a landscape. And just playing with Legos, so everybody knows how to do it. It's a simple thing. But you begin to introduce complexity, because when you build the city or a landscape or a river running through it, whatever, you see on a screen, in addition, you see the total CO2 output. You see the air pollution. You see the traffic density. You see the population density. You see the runoff from the fields and the water pollution. Now, imagine that. So here's my table here in Berlin. But there's another table in New York, and another one in Mumbai. And now my river on my landscape runs into the one in Mumbai, and my power grid is connected to New York. Now I get a call on Skype or Zoom or whatever with people at the other museum and say, wait a minute, what are you doing? The water, we're not getting any water and it's polluted. What are we doing? So all of a sudden, these hidden consequences of the science become tangible and become something for discussion, which I think is essential.
Thank you very much. I was actually going to pose a question about how AI can help us to feed in more variables. So that was the perfect answer to that as well. I think we're going to finish with that, but Ilan is here for the rest of the conference. So if you had a question that you weren't able to ask, please just find him during one of the sessions. And before you all jump up, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a really short coffee break, okay? But try to use a little bit of it to go to that bar camp board at the back and post an idea about what a bar camp could address tomorrow. That would be wonderful. So don't forget to do that in the course of the day. See you back here in 15 minutes, please. Thank you.